Okay, we are live. Let me introduce this episode of the Groovy podcast by saying the normal good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to a special edition of the Groovy podcast. In this particular case, I am talking to Dan Woods, Dan developer of Twitter fame, about all things reactive, especially concerning Ratpack and the Grails 3 release and the upcoming Spring Framework release, version 5, which will have reactive services inside it and as well as other capabilities. My name's Ken Cousin. I'm podcasting from Marlborough, Connecticut, and let me introduce Dan.
Hey.
Go ahead and say hi.
Hi, Dan Woods. I'm broadcasting from Buffalo, New York at the moment.
Yeah, these days you're really moving around a lot, right? Are you still in the van and you are, I mean, I can't help but go to the whole Pulp Fiction wandering the earth situation.
Yeah, we're moving around quite a bit. We're on basically a year-long road trip. We're just trying to see as much of the country as we can and take our kids with us to as many national parks as we can get to and cool spots. So we're at Niagara Falls right now. It's been really great. It's awesome.
That's amazing. So then you are going everywhere. Where are you headed next?
We are headed down to the New York City area. We're actually going to be in your neck of the woods for a little while. We're going to be staying in Connecticut, just north of New Haven.
Oh.
Yep. And then we're headed down to Florida for the winter.
That's a good idea. You'll be a snowbird, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, you have to let me know when you hope to be in the area because there's, I don't know, probably 1 in 5 chance I'll be in the area too. You never know.
True.
Have to take a look at it.
Yeah, we'll probably be able to catch up. We're going to be there for a while.
Oh, great. Well, that would be wonderful. I want to get started, but I want to start first of all on some actual background because I don't like to just jump right into the technical stuff. There are, as strange as it may seem, probably some people out there who are not familiar with you. Seems very unlikely. So let me at least say that Dan or Dan developer is, I suppose the best term would be infamous in the Groovy world as a person who speaks the truth to power, who is willing to take controversial positions, partly to learn something and partly just to mix things up. But your biggest notable achievement, and now you can list it as an achievement, is that you are the author of the O'Reilly book, Learning Ratpack.
That's right.
Which, how's that doing anyway?
Yep.
How's the book selling? Have you heard anything?
Yeah, I periodically check the figures just to kind of see where things are at. It's selling pretty well. Not quite as well as your book did, based off of the numbers that you told me. But yeah, there's been a notable amount of interest and both really good sales in both print and digital, which I thought was really great. People are actually picking up the print copy too.
Well, I figured you'd be able to check. Originally, I was thinking you'd be able to check because of all those zeros that jumped into your bank account, except for the fact that you are also well known for taking some of the proceeds and making sure they go to the Great Ladies organization that supports women in computing specifically, or in general, but also specifically in the Groovy community.
Yeah. So my entire share of the book, basically all my royalties, go directly to Great Ladies, which is a phenomenal organization. They, like you said, they support getting women into technology and other underrepresented groups. They host workshops. They send folks to conferences who maybe otherwise wouldn't be able to afford it, and they're really fantastic. So I wanted to make sure that having the first book on Ratpack, and with the amount of interest that we've had in Ratpack, that was a platform that you know, I'd be able to use for helping out the community and doing a little bit of good.
Now, speaking of Ratpack, you're a core committer on that project. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yep.
The project's currently being led by, is it Luke Daly?
Yep.
Who is very well known in the Groovy community. He's also a major player in the Gradle ecosystem.
Yep.
I believe he works specifically for, again, I always want to say Gradleware, but it's Gradle Incorporated, right?
Yeah. Yep.
But there are many other people who are also involved on the Ratpack project. I know Danny Young is one of them. You want to mention a couple others?
Yeah, Russ Hart, Marcin Erdman, whose name I just ruin every time. I'm sorry, Marcin. That's not how you say his name, but I don't really know how to say it, so we're gonna go with that. Yeah, who else do we have? David Carr, John Engelman. Man, I'm letting off a lot of people, and I'm sorry about that. But we at any given time we have 11 active core committers.
Well, if you forget somebody, we're going to be talking for a little while. Feel free to throw in another name as you go along.
Sure.
That's fine. By the way, I should mention just in passing that Danny and a few of the others, John Engelman, Craig Burke, a few others, have a new podcast themselves, the Fun Time Exception podcast. Right. And you were on the second version of that, right?
Yeah.
That podcast is a piece of work. I think when I talk to Baruch about an actual news type Groovy podcast, I'll be sure to put a link to that in the show notes, even though it's not directly related to Groovy. It's certainly indirectly related.
Yeah.
But I figured I'd at least mention it. I did get a chance to listen to the first couple of episodes, and it's, shall we say, highly entertaining.
That's kind of the whole idea. And also the idea is, you know, that we'll be able to touch on a broad range of subjects and technologies, and you know, try to tap all of our individual ecosystems and respective areas to try to get you know, more folks who have of different subjects on. So I think there'll be some pretty good ones going forward, and like you said, it's a lot of fun. I mean, the episode that I was on, which was maybe the last one.
Yeah.
They might have done another one since then, but we just talked and hung out for like 2 hours, and Michael was able to actually get it down to like under an hour of actual content, but it's just a fun time, you know.
Michael, what's his last name again? I keep forgetting.
Kasich.
Say it again, please.
Michael Kasich. He's at Womp Womp on Twitter.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Got it. I think he may be the only person who's appeared on it who I don't actually know personally, so I want to make sure I get that correct. Sure. Let's get back to Ratpack, by the way. When did you become involved in that project?
I became involved in Ratpack in, it must have been late 2012, early 2013, somewhere around there. I think that's about right. Yeah, it's been a number of years. But I had run into, I had heard Luke give a presentation at GreatConf about it. I sat in for that, and you know, Ratpack's had a really interesting history. It's kind of evolved. It's gone through a number of maintainers. The focus has changed. Originally, it was kind of set up to be like a Sinatra clone for the JVM, and it was specific to Groovy and all that kind of stuff. And so there were a number of conference presentations about it from those really early days. And I had looked at it back then, and I said, well, you know, that's a really neat idea. It's kind of cool. But you know, it was kind of a toy project for a while. And then Luke got involved and, you know, kind of saw the opportunity to tackle a much bigger space, which was having a really high throughput, really high performance, very memory efficient, CPU efficient web framework that would build on reactive programming principles and, you know, really be able to take a lot of traffic from one instance. And then also put a really good programming model around it. So it had been probably a year or so since I had seen it. And then I saw Luke give a presentation at GreatConf about what it was and what he was going for. And so I just built up a little app and played around with it. And I talked to Luke about it at GreatConf, and then I started to try to build WebSocket support into my app, and there wasn't great support for WebSockets. So I'd done some workarounds, and we were at GGX in London, and Luke was there. And so I talked to him about the WebSocket support, and we kind of went back and forth. And that was around the time that that he asked me to get involved with it, and so I wrote some code for the WebSocket stuff, and eventually he made it a lot better, obviously. But yeah, then that was around the time that he asked me to join the team, and I've been doing that in my free time ever since, pretty much.
Well, the project seems to be getting more attention. I have noticed certainly a pickup in interest regarding it. I did notice there was a Ratpack presentation at the Java 1 conference last week, which that's certainly a milestone, at any rate. I don't remember who gave that offhand. Do you?
Yeah, I think it was Laurent from Couchbase.
Right.
I think that's how you say his name. I'm so bad with names. But yeah, Couchbase has been doing a lot with showing Ratpack as a reactive web framework, and then having Couchbase be the data store behind it, which also has reactive extensions in their SDK. So the two are a really nice fit, and they've done a lot of work putting out examples and showing use cases and stuff like that. So they're a very involved member. Also worth noting is Heroku is also very involved. They've done a lot of work showing, with having their own build packs, having specific build packs for identifying when you have a Ratpack app and automatically configuring your cloud runtime around that. They've also done, I know, a lot of work getting Ratpack integrated with Kafka. So they're really involved, which is fantastic. Yeah, over the last 2 years or so, ending last summer, at the end of last summer, we had done a lot of work in Ratpack to really bring it up to snuff and to really make it a production grade web framework, and make sure that we were addressing the problems that people were having, and making sure that we were providing the most performance, and all that kind of stuff. So when we went 1.0 last year, that was really our way of saying, like, yeah, it's been vetted, it's battle tested now, it's a real production web framework. And since then we've had 4 minor releases that are all compatible back to the 1.0.0. But yeah, I mean, adoption has really picked up. We have a lot of people in our Slack. If you go to ratpack.io, there's a link to join our Slack. Yeah, it's really come along nicely, and a big part of that has also been that because of the way that Ratpack handles dependency injection through the concept of a registry, you can have any registry backing, right? And that means that you can use Juice, you can use Spring, you can use your custom in-house DI framework, whatever you want, and just access everything through the API of the registry. And then we do other things in Groovy applications that allow you to do like dependency injection using variable arguments to closures, for example. So you never have to think about, like, doing an annotation or explicitly pulling it out of the registry, anything like that. So one of the big things that we did with the help of some folks from Pivotal was get Spring support into Ratpack. So Spring Boot developers who like Spring and are comfortable in that space and want to leverage the full Spring ecosystem can bring over their the stuff that they already know how to do and really quickly get it integrated into a Ratpack app. So you get all the benefits of the stuff that you like with Spring, and all the performance benefits and the really nice APIs and DSLs that Ratpack offers. Those two have a nice connection with each other.
As I recall, you've got a whole chapter in your book on Ratpack and Spring integration.
Yep. Sorry, we should be clear on that. Ratpack and Spring Boot, Spring integration is a separate project.
Oh, yes, I didn't mean to say it that way.
I knew what you
Very
meant.
good. Right. Integrating the Spring framework and Ratpack together. Very good. Yeah, I don't mean Spring integration. Right.
Right.
Very good. And of course, Spring Boot is mostly a way just to bootstrap your project. It's not, I mean, you're still using the core of Spring under the hood.
Yep.
But now, one last thing before we dive into some of the technical details. Actually, two last things. One is, what's the current version? It's like 1.4 something. Is that right?
Man, I'd have to look. 1.4.2, I believe.
If that's easy enough. The other question then is basically, you mentioned that the throughput is, everything's been optimized to get the best possible throughput that you can get. Mm-hmm. And I understand that, but it's 1.4.2, by the way. It was released on September 13th, so just a couple of weeks ago. At any rate, I know you've given statistics in the past demonstrating how awesome this throughput could be. Do you happen to recall any of the numbers that you could just tease people with, so that when we talk about the technology, they'll go, really? How do I get that kind of throughput out of it?
Yeah. So I was very privileged to be a part of Spring One this year, which was in Las Vegas, and just an absolutely wonderful conference. I really think that it's always been a wonderful conference. This year, Pivotal led it. Prior to this year, it was No Fluff, which you're a speaker on the No Fluff tour. And I speak at a lot of No Fluff conferences as well. It's always been a really great opportunity to learn about the Spring ecosystem, which is, progressing so fast every year. But so this year, they invited me to talk about Ratpack and Spring Boot together. And the title of the talk was High Performance Microservices with Ratpack and Spring Boot. And basically out of that, I wanted to show how much performance you can get out of a Ratpack application that's using Spring Boot and Spring APIs behind it. The numbers were really good. I would have to look specifically, but I believe on my SlideShare, slideshare.net/danveloper, I believe that I posted my slides. And in those slides, I have the numbers. But basically, we're talking about it's the very first one on there. Basically, we're talking about a single instance of Ratpack using Spring Boot as well behind the scenes, but the real benefit is in Reactive's non-blocking I/O and its reactive programming model, because that gives you a lot of high throughput performance. But for a single instance, I mean, we're actually talking to a database and doing actual work behind the scenes. So I'm saying much more than much more than just a simple hello world. We're in the tens of thousands of requests per second for a single instance running on these very small, sometimes free tier AWS instances. So yeah, I mean, the performance numbers look really good. They look even better for a simple hello world, which from the 0913 release, which is where I did the original test, we were able to get up around 1 million requests per second for a hello world. So yeah, I mean, the performance is something that we've been really focused on from the beginning. We really want to make sure that, because you're going to be running in the cloud probably today, that we want to make sure that your application is able to properly utilize the resources that you have available there. And using something like Ratpack means that, ultimately you'll end up spending a lot less money because it's able to maximize your capabilities, right?
Now, the slides that you mentioned have some links inside them to the performance numbers, which apparently are in your GitHub account.
Right.
So I'll try to see if I can put some kind of link in the show notes regarding that, assuming we have show notes for this particular show. But we'll do that. But regardless, the slides that you mentioned are in the SlideShare account, and I see the performance numbers are linked inside the slides themselves. Now, part of the reason we're having this discussion at all is because late last week, during the Java 1 conference, as it turns out, there was an announcement by the Spring Framework people regarding Reactive, just regarding their support for reactive programming, for the reactive streams, everything like that within Spring. And as sometimes occurs, this spawned a Twitter storm, I suppose would be the right term for it, that you are heavily involved in, saying, why are they basically reinventing the flat tire, right? When you reinvent the wheel and you get it wrong. Why not just use Ratpack? We've already worked everything out here. Why don't we just use that? And by the way, Grails has support as well. And what's interesting, of course, is that some of the core Spring players got involved in that discussion and were very forthcoming and very helpful. And you immediately said, wow, that's great. I didn't know this, this, and this. And the discussion went back and forth and looked to be very, very useful.
Yeah.
Now, I have still got reactive and reactive streams and reactive programming in general on my list of things to learn, to dig into. I only know the terminology, some of the very basics. I was hoping that for those people who have heard about reactive but don't know much about it, if we could talk about how these things work and what they look like inside of Ratpack and Grails and potentially Spring 5 MVC, when they're going to have their reactive programming there. So can you give a little bit of an introduction there, or to pick one, or the overall concepts, and then we'll dive in?
Yeah. So this actually is a pretty in-depth conversation. So much so that an entire chapter of my book is dedicated to talking about this.
Right.
But the basic idea is that with reactive programming, you're given constructs for defining the way that data will flow, and how your application is going to be able to access data at any particular time. And specifically what these constructs help you with is working with asynchronous APIs. So in a traditional non-blocking web application, and basically anybody who's written JavaScript will understand the idea of an asynchronous API and what a traditional one looks like. So traditionally you make some call, and then you also have to give the method that you're calling a callback function that'll be invoked when that data becomes available, right?
Right.
Because it's an asynchronous API. It's non-blocking under the hood. We have to wait for that data, for something to signal us through an event that data is available, and then the data goes off to your callback function. Now, the big problem is with data control flow in an asynchronous scenario. So you provide that callback, but if you need that data in the context of multiple asynchronous calls, or potentially dealing with a list of data in a way that would be asynchronous, where you would probably make many calls or anything like that, then we get into this scenario that results in callback hell, right? Where you're nesting callbacks, asynchronous calls within callbacks and further down. And it becomes really unwieldy, very hard to debug, very hard to manage, and just overall really difficult. So the whole idea with reactive programming is that you're given these functional constructs where you can say, I'm going to make a call to some asynchronous API to get some data, and then I'm going to stream that data through basically through a pipeline that we're going to be able to do additional processing on. And that processing could be manipulating the data, interpreting the data, etc., or potentially making other asynchronous calls. And then that data will eventually be processed through the pipeline and then be available at the end of the pipeline for you to do additional processing with. So is
that kind of like having an event bus on some of these things, or is it more involved than that?
It's more involved in the sense that you're working with the data specifically, and then all of the eventing and all the asynchronous aspects happen behind the scenes. But reactive programming is a really nice abstraction for for synchronous programming, for asynchronous programming, etc. So you can basically, using these reactive programming techniques, you can have a synchronous call in the background that will inform your reactive processing pipeline when data becomes available. Likewise, so that can be a blocking call. That can be something like what you do today in servlets, right? But then when you're ready, you can change out whatever that implementation was to be asynchronous, to be non-blocking, and you don't have to change any of your user code that was doing any of the processing of that data. Furthermore, reactive programming lets you work with collections of data and sets of data in the way of a stream. So you can have multiple model objects, for example, and you will stream those through the pipeline and operate against them on an individual basis. So you don't have to worry about looping through a list or anything like that. You can just send it into your reactive stream. It'll do all the processing, and then it'll come out. And this is very similar to folks who have some exposure to pub/sub type operations. This is very similar to that, because in that scenario, your user code will construct this pipeline, and then when you subscribe to it, it makes a request up the pipeline, asking all of these producers to produce some data for your subscription to be able to process, and that's kind of what it's all about. Now, the benefit to this is that basically in a framework like Ratpack, there's an event loop, and the event loop is what is responsible for so it's Netty under the covers. Netty has an event loop and an event loop group, and this is what's responsible for handling the eventing of non-blocking networking activity to its asynchronous APIs. Now, Ratpack on top of that event loop gets that data, and then it throws it into a reactive processing pipeline, throws it down your handler chain, and then inside of that, you can work with that data in a reactive way, where when you're done doing any of your asynchronous work, then that pipeline completes, and you can respond to the request, and that also goes back into the event loop as an event, and then it goes back out. And this allows us to handle a lot of asynchronous events in a very fast way.
So when you talk about reactive programming, there's concepts, and then there are various APIs that implement them. The one that I think most people have heard of these days is RxJava, for example. Now, does Ratpack use RxJava natively? Do you use your own implementation of the concepts? I assume you can use either.
Yeah, Ratpack has support for 3 different reactive programming types. The first one is Ratpack has its own implementation, and this is the Promise API that it has available, and this has support for some of the more common reactive constructs and functional programming constructs as well, like mapping data, flat mapping, other promises, et cetera, et cetera. So it has support for that. We also have support for RxJava, and we have a native translation layer from our promise type over to RxJava's observable types. And then the third one that we support is an implementation of the Reactive Streams API. So Reactive Streams is basically a standardization around all of these reactive concepts, right? So all the fixtures for being able to set up a stream of data, being able to work with data and asynchronous APIs in a reactive way. So we implement the Reactive Streams API in Ratpack. So then you're working with data in the construct of a publisher, a subscriber, a transformer, et cetera, et cetera.
Now that's the one, if I recall correctly, that's the one that the Spring people are talking about incorporating into Spring 5. It was just an implementation of Reactive Streams?
Yeah, and that comes to them by way of Project Reactor. Reactor is another reactive programming library, and very far along, really excellent library to work with. It's built around the LMAX disruptor. It's an implementation of that way of doing things for eventing. But Reactor has a native translation layer between its reactive programming constructs, which are Flux and Mono, to the reactive streams publisher and subscriber. That becomes pretty important when we're talking about Spring and Ratpack integration, because Ratpack has the ability to transform from a publisher into a promise type, which is its native way of doing this. It also will probably allow us to bridge the Reactor Flux and Mono types to a Ratpack promise by way of a reactive streams publisher and subscriber.
So they'll be bridges from all these different APIs to each other,
right?
As you were saying, and then so Ratpack uses the Promise API natively,
right?
But they can also translate from the Promise API to, or the other way, from RX Java or the reactive streams.
Yep, exactly.
Now, when I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, one thing to point out is, well, there's two things that I just wanted to point out. One of them is that'll be totally relevant to this podcast is that as part of our Groovy support in Ratpack, we publish Groovy extensions for the promise type for RxJava observables for reactive streams publishers. So if you have a promise, basically what this allows us to do is if you have a promise and you also have RxJava, that support in your project, you can just do promise.observe, and it'll translate that into an RxJava observable. And likewise on the reactive stream side of things, you can do, for example, .publish, and that'll turn it into a publisher. So that's kind of a neat thing. We're making use of the language's mechanism for adding methods onto different types, which is really cool. So the second thing I want to talk about is that we're in all of these different reactive programming libraries. It's all a really good way to abstract the way that you're working with the data and how you're getting that data, right? So I talked about you can have the implementation be something synchronous, something blocking, right? And it'll return that to your reactive pipeline for processing. But behind the scenes, it's still synchronous. It's not using non-blocking I/O. It's not asynchronous, anything like that. But then when you want to, you can very easily trade that out for an asynchronous processing flow. That works very well, and that's really great. But there's still a problem in asynchronous web applications in the sense that you don't get a lot of determinism in the way that your data is going to be requested and the way that the data is going to become available to your application at any given time, which is something that you really need. You need determinism when you're doing any kind of processing for a web application, because the request came in, you need to get the data, you need to know that the data is available at a specific time, available in a certain form at a particular point in your code. And then when all of that translation and mutation is done, then you want to be able to send that back to the client, right? So web applications really kind of fit very well into this request response synchronous flow, right?
Right.
When things are asynchronous, it introduces a lot of not just complexity but non-determinism. There's a temporal disconnect in asynchronous programming between the time that you've made the call to the time that the data from that call will be available. So Ratpack's reactive construct of a promise is much more than just a way to abstract over the fact that something asynchronous has happened. What it also does is it basically any of the asynchronous calls that you're going to use when they're made in the context of a promise, what Ratpack does is it'll serialize those asynchronous events so that as it goes through and handles all of your processing, you know at any given time that a call is going to be made at a certain time, data is going to be available at a certain time, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a very good way. It allows you to program as though you're as though you're writing synchronous code, but still doing it in an asynchronous way.
So the order of the requests and responses is predictable.
Exactly. And so when we talk about integration with things like RxJava, things like reactive streams, et cetera, these are things that under the covers, so even though you're working with an RxJava observable, or even though you're working with an RxStreams publisher or subscriber or any of those other types, basically behind the scenes, Ratpack is going to translate that into a promise so that it can sequence those asynchronous events for you. So even though you're working with RxJava, you still get the deterministic processing that Ratpack provides, and so that's the kind of thing.
Sorry. So you don't know when a piece of data or process is going to complete, but you do know that they will come back in the proper order.
No, so you not only know that the data is going to be available at a specific time, but you also know the order in which the calls will be made.
How do you know when the data will be available? I mean, how do you know it'll be available at a specific time?
Because we're sequencing the asynchronous events, which means that you've made some asynchronous call, you've subscribed to get that data. It's not going to move on to the next asynchronous call until the subscription is properly processed for the prior call.
Okay, so that definitely keeps them in order. I just thought you're never really sure how long it's going to take a process to complete. That's all.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. In terms of the amount of time, yeah. I mean that's totally. There are a lot of factors, obviously, that go into that.
Right. But that is a benefit, though, that to be able to predict that if you made the calls A, B, C, and D, they'll come back in responses in order A, B, C, and D. That's one of the real complexities, as you say, of asynchronous programming.
Right.
Now, when you were talking about Spring, your initial impression was that Spring did not have that sort of support, and yet the responses you got seemed to change your mind about it. What did you learn about the Spring implementation that you didn't know earlier?
A bunch of things, and I will say I was a little quick to the tweet button when I was going through and looking at this stuff. I should have dug a little bit deeper. I did publish. I did publish a blog post later to kind of clear up my thread on Twitter a little bit better. So initially when I started looking at it, it looked like the web side of things. So taking a step back, we already talked a little bit about Reactor. So Reactor is the mechanism under the covers that is powering all of the reactive concepts in Spring 5. Reactor is phenomenal. It's a really great library. It's very high performance. It's really far along. It's been developed for a number of years by an incredibly talented group of developers who know way more about this shit than I'll ever know. But that's the underpinning to Spring 5's reactive support. So initially, when I was looking at the code, what looked to it looked to me like what they were doing was just putting servlets on top of this stuff, and then adapting reactive programming concepts around that typical thread per request, thread per connection, servlet API model, that way of doing things. And that's in my opinion, that's pointless. It's pointless because you're not getting any of the benefits of non-blocking. You're not getting any of the efficiencies of an event loop under the hood. Even though Reactor will still have that idea behind the scenes, you're still limited by servlet API. That was one of the big problems that I had when I first looked, because I didn't see where they were using NIO or where they were using other async stuff at the networking layer that would make it actually worthwhile to have reactive programming on top of it. Rawson, who's a core developer on Spring, he was really quick to point out that they're not just using servlets, but it was really decoupled. So I'm not super familiar with the Spring framework code base, and that was kind of a part of my confusion was in looking at the Spring Web reactive stuff. I didn't see anything about using NIO or using other async servlet container or anything like that under the covers. All I saw was the adapter to servlets, and I jumped to the conclusion that that was what they were doing. They have the capability to do that, but by default they use Netty, which is really great, because that will give them all the high performance networking. And then they put basically what they're allowing you to do is continue to build controllers in the way that you normally would, Spring controllers, and then you would just respond with a flux type or a monotype, depending on whether you have a collection of data that you're responding with or an individual piece of data. And then that will go through the whole process of sending that back as a response to the caller. But that's really cool because folks who are already familiar with the Spring programming model and building Spring controllers and all that kind of stuff, they don't have to change the way that they're doing things necessarily, right? They need to become familiar with these reactive types, but they don't need to do much more than that. So that's benefit number one, is the programming model doesn't change for folks who are already into it. Benefit number two is that they are targeting a real wide range of underlying runtime. And by that I mean basically they're saying we're going to support Tomcat, we're going to support basically we're going to support anything that will do any kind of servlet API. If you're using servlet API 3.1 plus, we'll use the async features right out of the box. If you don't want to use servlets at all, you don't have to, and none of your stuff needs to change, and we're going to throw Netty under the covers. And meanwhile, none of your stuff necessarily has to change, right? If you're just building an application that has controllers and services and the views that you like, stuff like that, none of that stuff needs to change. You can swap out the underpinnings at any time. So why does that matter? That matters if you work in in an organization or an environment where you don't necessarily have control over what is going to underpin your application, but you still want to move forward with building these reactive concepts with the idea that, like, yeah, when that possibility opens, that you're going to switch over to use NIO, you're going to switch over to use Netty, and you're automatically going to benefit from all the performance characteristics that you get out of that without having to switch any of your actual code over. So that's a really neat thing.
That's amazing if it works out that way. I was under the impression that you couldn't just take a Spring MVC app and suddenly make it reactive. It is going to take a little bit more thought than that. But if as you say, you can plan for the future for that sort of thing, then you get all the benefits as soon as they switch to Netty or some other cloud-based architecture as well.
Right.
Now, how about Grails? Now, Grails has done an enormous amount of work in order to make it easy to build RESTful web services. Right. And this is very popular these days. I know that Graham Roche gave a presentation where he talked about not just the RESTful web services, but also the async capabilities inside of Grails. I don't know how often that's being used. Is that related to any of the stuff you're talking about, or have they added something in addition for reactive streams?
Yeah, so I guess what I'll say is, like, the big problem that I have with all of these things that are going on is that they're all traveling in orthogonal directions, right? They're all kind of going down their own paths without ever converging on one another. So in Ratpack, like I said, we have support for Spring Boot, right? But we haven't been involved, and probably at some fault to me and others involved in the project, we haven't been involved in the Spring 5 reactive stuff at all. Which would be a really nice integration in Ratpack to further make both Spring and Ratpack better in the long run. As far as I know, Grails, which has Spring under the covers,
right.
They also don't have any involvement necessarily with the stuff going on in Spring 5. So they're building out their own structure for reactive async programming, and these are things that are we're all kind of in the same corner of the ecosystem, and to be doing the same work many different ways, it seems it seems a little silly in my opinion, especially because something like the work that they're doing in Spring 5 would be something that would be an immediate benefit to a lot of different projects that that sit on top of it. And my hope is that as this stuff evolves and as Spring 5 continues to set out release candidates and continue to get to a point where it's ready for a final release, that maybe we'll all converge on a common path with one another and make sure that we and by that I don't necessarily mean that we need to stop programming and wait for the Spring 5 guys to be done, but be cognizant of the fact that these things are being done and make sure that we have an adaptation layer, so that, for example, Ratpack can cleanly integrate with Spring 5. Spring Boot that gets built on Spring 5 can cleanly integrate with Ratpack. Grails can make sure that their async support cleanly gets into Reactor, and vice versa, all that kind of stuff, right? That's the direction that I want things to go. I want us to all be on the same page, and for a lot of the conversation on reactive programming, it really was on the and had been on the same page for a real long time, because basically there was only RX Java, right? And
right.
And RX Java was kind of leading in the field, and if you were building anything reactive in Java, there was a really high chance, and there still is today, that you're going to be using RX Java, right? So in terms of compatibility or adaptation layers, like, none of that really matters. But that's kind of what reactive streams is all about, right? Is having a standardized API that many different reactive libraries can integrate with to make sure that we can do that kind of stuff. I can tell you today, Ratpack and Spring 5, they're going to integrate cleanly with one another, which is great, because we both implement that reactive streams API. Now, back to your original question, which was with Grails. I think Grails has had async support for a real long time.
Right.
And for a while, they had their own concept of a promise. I'm not sure if it's there, if it's gone. But a lot of the new stuff is moving to RX Java, which is really cool. So they have support in Gorm now for RX Java. I talked to Graham at GreatConf. He was talking about building out a profile for Grails 3 that was based on Netty, which is really cool. So I'll take a step back. As part of all this work with Spring 5, one of the really neat things that they're doing and have done is decoupled from the servlet API for all their stuff, right? And this allows them to do things like say, yeah, we're not going to build on a servlet container. We're still going to have these things like controllers and services and views and all that kind of stuff that you're familiar with, but we're going to put another abstraction layer there that we can adapt the servlet API onto, but will also allow us to use things like Netty channels and Netty pipelines and stuff like that. This was something that Grails had done as part of Grails 3, maybe even a little bit before that. I'm not 100% sure on the timeline, but they're totally decoupled from the servlet API, which means that there can be a Grails profile that builds on other things like Netty or like Ratpack or like VertX or like your custom homegrown web application container, whatever it might be, and that's really neat. But so that means that the path is really easy for Grails to get to being able to use RxJava in your controllers as part of Gorm, in your services, wherever you want to throughout your app. So it's really nice to see that evolution taking place. And eventually, it's my belief that they'll also have non-blocking networking possibilities as a result of this, and you'll have screaming fast Grails apps.
Well, when you look at the history of Grails, now I don't know the plans of the Grails core team. I assume these things are evolving all the time. But if you look at Grails in the past, they have traditionally built their own mechanisms when Spring wasn't ready yet. When they didn't already have something available, they would build whatever they needed, or even not Spring. I mean, the whole use of Gantt, before Gradle was ready for prime time, if you will, as just an example. And since, as you remind everybody, Grails is built on top of Spring Boot and therefore on top of the Spring Core itself. Yeah, I wouldn't be at all surprised if they're very aware of all these developments in Spring, and whenever they plan to version Grails to use Spring 5, they'll probably be planning to take advantage of whatever Spring 5 incorporates. So yeah, I imagine you're right. I mean, it's probably a question right now of people going down parallel paths, mostly so they could learn what the right costs and benefits are, and to learn how to use these various APIs, and then they'll all decide, okay, let's build something we can integrate together, and what turns out to be very successful. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised by that. Now, of course, the biggest thing to come out of Grails is that this week they went 3.2 became final, and in fact, I think that was Wednesday. I mean, just like the day before yesterday or something. And one of the biggest features of the 3.2 release was the so-called RX GORM, the ability to do reactive with GORM. Now, that's only with, what do you call it, NoSQL databases. You can't do that with a relational database, apparently. They don't have the extensions. Although you did mention Couchbase earlier. Is there anything you can say about that?
I honestly, I don't know too much about Couchbase. I've never used it, but I do know that they are, they have reactive programming extensions in their SDK.
So it comes down to the various databases have to provide a reactive, provide reactive support themselves, and then the RX Java can integrate with it, or is it something at a higher layer than that?
I don't know. I mean, they wouldn't necessarily have to, but it does get tricky when you're trying to work with synchronous APIs, like, for example, JDBC, and say that you want to be doing that, but saying that the rest of the infrastructure is going to be async, but then we still have this blocking call.
Right.
So, like in Ratpack, we've put a lot of thought into that, and we provide a blocking type of promise that will schedule any of the synchronous work that you need to do off onto an IO thread pool, and then safely and cleanly return it to your main event loop for further processing. But there's a lot of complexity in doing that, so sometimes it's just better to wait for any of the vendors to provide, a library that that is non-blocking, that is using, so Couchbase, for example, their library provides, I believe, NIO support via Netty, but then also their APIs are able to be translated to RX Java observable types.
I think the example that I saw Graham do at GrayConf in Copenhagen was using Mongo, so that there was already RX Java-based support for that, and he was able to incorporate it without any trouble. And it may, who knows, further the use of NoSQL databases, if that's helpful, or we'll see. I noticed that in Java 8, as people transition to that, and by the way, that's another thing that's helping Ratpack, because Ratpack was one of the first APIs, first major projects I knew about that mandated Java 8 as a minimum JDK for a whole bunch of good reasons, but it was required, and the adoption of Java 8 seems to be really picking up steam at this point, so that's no longer keeping people out, if you will. But at any rate, one of the things that I've noticed as people adopt Java 8 is that they're surprised that there's no database support anywhere in the Java 8 API. In other words, JDBC is the same JDBC we've had forever. Even JPA doesn't really buy you anything with the new Java 8 constructs until you already have your collection of objects, and then can use the whole Stream API at that point. I know there's libraries for this, but I imagine this is something that's going to be an active area of research in the future as well.
Yeah, I think with Java 1 was, like you said, just a couple weeks ago, and they were talking about it as part of Java 9 having non-blocking
Right.
JDBC support, which will
But
be huge.
That would be enormous, but that may be a while. So, I mean, it's a lot of people are, I mean, the adoption of Java 8 is moving along, but I would be surprised if it was more than half the industry at this point. I mean, we still got a long way to go, and there's a lot of companies who are very slow, reluctant to pick that up. So we do have to kind of, I'm sorry, you were going to say?
Yeah, I was just going to say one more thing. I don't know for 100% sure, but I believe that Spring 5 is also minimum JDK 8.
Yes, I think you're right about that. That's again, that's going to work out well in terms of timing, because as the adoption of Java 8 keeps picking up, then Spring 5, which I believe is scheduled to be released at the end of this year, right?
I don't know.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure either at the end of this year or beginning of next year, but it's on that schedule, I believe. That will again push more and more companies in the industry to upgrade to Java 8 anyway, and take advantage of the new programming model and the streams and the concurrent collections and all those different things that are a part of it.
Yeah, one thing I'll say about that. One thing I'll say about that is the milestones for Spring 5 are out today. So don't wait for it to be final. You know, start playing with it today. Get your feedback in. You know, make sure that your stuff works, because you know they publish the milestones for a reason, to let you get exposure and get your input in, and make sure that the final release is going to work for you. So if you're a Spring user and you're hoping to move to Spring 5, start playing with it today.
Well, we do have to kind of bring this pretty much to a close. I'm looking forward to all these changes. This is one of those trends in the industry that really seems to be, you know, leading to rapid adoption, and a lot of people are really digging into it. And it's really great that a tool like Ratpack is ahead of the curve on this, and may even provide a nice mechanism for people to learn all this stuff. Not to mention the fact that with the additional Groovy support, it'll encourage more people to pick up Groovy as they go along. But I guess by way of finishing things up, you do have one opportunity here to give Craig Burke or even Kyle Boone a hard time about something. Is there anything you want to say to them or about them or whatever that occurs to you at this point?
Oh man, I should have pre-planned for this. No, I don't.
Well, I mean, Craig was the creator of the entire unfollowed developer movement, right?
I know.
Yeah, and Kyle Boone takes every opportunity possible to remind everybody of that and to try to push that along. I'm afraid that I have been in the unenviable position of well, not necessarily fighting back against it, but I keep bringing you on podcasts and mentioning your stuff, and therefore encouraging people to follow you. And I'm not sure that's a long-term good thing. I just thought I'd give you a chance to fight back if you had anything to say about them. Not so.
One thing I will say is that I was talking to Craig the other day in private message, and he admitted to me that he actually really likes Dane Cook's comedy. He actually called him an artist.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, okay, well, there'll be a reaction to that, no question. Well, by the way, just one last thing. Are you working on anything now that gives you a chance to use some of these things? Are you doing anything interesting these days that you can talk about?
What I will say is I have several Ratpack apps in production, or some form of it. I mostly work on DevOps style tooling for basically for enabling things like continuous delivery, continuous deployment, managing cloud footprints, stuff like that. And a lot of stuff in the cloud is really amenable to asynchronous style things. So for building that kind of stuff, Ratpack is a really great fit. You know, because it's able to tie all that stuff together into a really nice flow and programming model. So,
well, that's great. I'm glad to hear you're getting a chance to actually put it into practice and then learn whatever ramifications that may come of that will come up, and then take advantage of it in the future. I imagine you will have more things to say as you gain more experience and as some projects complete. I look forward to hearing about it. I really appreciate your taking the time to to talk about these topics with everybody. And definitely you're a friend of the Groovy podcast. We hope to see you here on a frequent basis.
Great.
So thanks a lot, and take care.
Thanks, Ken.